Hello, beautiful people, and welcome. To the Chasca post-release analysis. As usual for the post-releases, we're going to be going through our pre-release video, going through the things we got right, things we got wrong, the things we forgot to mention. So let's get right into it. When it comes to base stats, something I talk about every time we get a new carry, the base attack itself doesn't matter too much because in a vacuum it doesn't mean anything, but the base HP and the base defense do mean something in a vacuum. And her base HP and base defense are honestly pretty low. This is a character that is honestly pretty squishy, but it is going to actually matter a lot because she doesn't actually have the best options when it comes to defensive utility in her teams. Yeah, so that's definitely the case. There is definitely some risk involved when you're playing her. That being said, the fact that she flies means that, well, you are really squishy and it's really easy to get one-shot by stuff. There's also a lot of attacks that just won't hit you. I think the best example of both points is against the Hydro Tulpa, which is currently in Abyss. Against the Tulpa, Chasca has the ability to kind of wiggle herself over the hitbox of Tulpa's attacks. But also, if she gets hit by one of them, she's dead. So basically, the way that it works is if you try to move up, it'll cost a lot of Night Soul, right? However, there is a way to move up a little bit without it costing any Night Soul. Like this. By colliding into hitboxes that are effectively leading upwards, where when there's an incline, that incline can lead you to go up or down depending on, the way of the incline. So like this, you go down, and like this, you go up. And this doesn't make you consume more Night Soul than if you were just moving around normally. And you can also do it while you're aiming and shooting. Against a Tulpa, if you're just standing at normal height, you're still potentially gonna get hit, but if you just move into him a little, it makes you go up enough that you're out of range of most of its attacks. Some of the attacks can still hit you.
Oh, so crazy.
As shown right there, but it's a lot easier to dodge most of them. The main thing though is that you don't really have a way of just like dashing in your skill. Like you can do this if you want, but as you can see, right, it consumes pretty much all of your Night Soul in one go. So you really don't want to have to dash. And so if you're not doing it properly and positioning yourself so you don't get hit, it is very easy to die. But if you are, you can avoid most of the attack. She behaves a little bit like Neuvillette, where you can kite around and dodge most of the enemy attacks just by moving, because she has a lot of freedom of movement even while she's doing her damage. But unlike Neuvillette, she's not an HP scaler, so she's not incredibly tanky to begin with, which means if you f up once, you'll die. She is a Natlan carry, which means her best set is going to be the Obsidian Codex, which gives you 40% crit rate. So because her base crit rate is 24.2, you're starting at 64.2, which means that if on top of that you're running a crit rate weapon, it becomes very easy to start overcapping on crit. Overcapping on crit is definitely a problem if you're using any sort of crit rate weapon. And the reality is that even if you're slightly overcapped, Skyward ARP is slightly better than her free-to-play options. And so it's going to be the case for a lot of people that they end up overcapped on crit. I'm overcapped on crit. Like my best Chasca build is with Skyward Harp, and it overcaps on crit by 6% because none of my other weapons would be better than Skyward Harp. So that's definitely an issue that you can run into, overcapping on crit. That's it for the basic explanation of her kit, and it's a really cool kit. I've been wanting an Animo character whose main source of damage is absorption, non-Animo damage for a very long time. I think that having that absorption be based on party members rather than based on what's currently on the enemy when you use your abilities is really cool because it lets you do interesting reaction stuff. And as of now, beta version 5, it doesn't look like she is getting affected by the Zajef curse. It's not looking like Neuvillette, but her better teams do seem to have pretty good damage. Yeah, so that's true. I still think she's a very interesting character, and I do think that she turned out to be a fairly strong one, but really nothing like all that crazy. I mean, I talked about it in my first impressions video, where I thought she was pretty much about as good as I expected her to be, and my thoughts on that haven't changed. She's a character who, in single target, is fairly good. In AoE, kind of sucks. I do think it's important to remember that the current Abyss Blessing is really good for her, and that won't always be the case. So keep that in mind. But she's still a fairly good character. The biggest potential issue when it comes to Chasca is going to be her team building restrictions. She's an attack scaling character that triggers reactions based on the elements in your party, and she has pretty good scaling. But the fact that she can't work with Geo Animal or Dendo characters, or not that she can't work, but that she's heavily incentivized not to use them, it heavily limits her options, and it makes it so that the few characters that actually have great synergy with her, namely Bennett, Farina, and then a few others, are just so far above the rest that her good teams are going to be very repetitive. That is definitely true. I think that as of now, Chasca pretty much has like 4 teammates. She has Bennett, Farina, Xiangling, and Ororon, and any team that's running someone other than one of those 4 is gonna be kind of ass compared to them. I will say though, and here we're getting into a little bit of leak discussion, so if you don't want any spoilers on leaked kits, here's your warning. There is going to be a new one in the next patch. Citlali is looking like a very strong option for Chasca, because not only is she going to be a very strong option offensively, she's also going to be a very strong option defensively, because she's a shielder that is good offensively. I talked in this video a little bit about the Shenhe teams, but they're not great. They're like noticeably worse than the other ones. In any case, this is the list of bows I want to talk about. Honestly, I don't really have anything to add to the weapon stuff. Order them from best to worst. I think this is fairly accurate. And now finally teams. Chasca's best team is looking like it's gonna be Bennett, Farina, Ororon, and the second best team is looking like it's gonna be Bennett, Farina, Xiangling. Okay, after having played a bunch with both of them, as much as it pains me to admit, I've kind of liked the Xiangling team more than the Ororon team. It makes me sad because I know people are tired of Xiangling, but I mean, yeah. That being said, the Ororon team hasn't felt much worse. It's felt somewhat similar. Part of that is probably because my Ororon is not C6. Ororon's constellations do a lot to help him, and not having the C6 is gonna make a noticeable difference. One thing that I obviously haven't mentioned in the pre-release is how Chasca is going to be working with Mavuika and Citlali, which are characters that are coming in 5.3. It's looking like both of them are gonna be very good for her teams. Mavuika's burst's initial hit out damages most other characters' full rotation. So it's kind of crazy like that. And she also gives you a fairly good damage percent buff to your active character if you're playing her as a support, where you just use her burst and then swap out. It's likely going to be worse than using Mavuika as a carry, but because she's looking fairly strong. But right now I'm talking about V3 Mavuika. She could change by the time it goes live, but it's very likely that she is going to be just as good, if not better, than Xiangling in the Chasca teams, just as a burst bond, right? Where you swap into her, use your burst, and then you swap out. And if you're playing her with either Farina or Citlali, you'll be able to trigger a reaction on her burst, and that's just gonna make it kind of pog. So the other character that's coming 5.3, Citlali, is also going to be very good with her. Like I already talked about earlier, she can fulfill the role of being that character that allows Chasca to trigger reactions on her shots. But then on top of that, she's also going to shred pyro resistance if you're playing her with Farina. Also shred hydro resistance for Farina, although I'm not a huge fan of teams that play cryo and hydro units for melt, because against bosses you're going to end up losing reactions because of the way the frozen aura, and it just doesn't get applied to bosses. But then on top of that, Citlali is also a catalyst user, with TDDS as a very good option for her, who has a somewhat okay personal damage and has defensive utility, and can run Cinder City, which makes her just a very strong option in the last slot for her teams. So I would add Bennett, Mavuika, Citlali, or Bennett, Mavuika, Farina, or Bennett, Xiangling, Citlali as other very strong Chasca teams. If I were talking about her once Mavuika and Citlali comes out, assuming they don't get changed from B3. Again, it's possible they do get changed from B3. Characters getting rebalanced in beta is a very normal thing. It's likely it's going to happen, but I still wanted to talk about it a little bit.
Looking at the damage, the Xiangling team seems to be all like somewhat similar to the Ororon team. However, Chasca is a range character, and being forced to stay melee range because of Xiangling, especially in a team that doesn't have a lot of resistance to interruption, on a character that is as squishy as Chasca is.
Yeah, I don't think this is as much of a problem as I thought it would be. Bennett is too important in her teams to ditch. And with Bennett, you're kind of forced not to move around too much anyways. So having to stay relatively close to the enemies with Xiangling hasn't really been too much of an issue. It can be annoying a little bit against enemies that move a lot, like Consecrated Beasts, because you have to choose between staying in Bennett Burst and following the enemy so that your Xiangling Burst can hit them. But that's not really that many enemies.
Other than this, you can also think about using characters. I'm not going to ride the Bennett Farina again, but you can use defensive focused characters like Lila. If you don't have Farina, you can use other characters like Shenhe that will allow you to potentially trigger reactions and give you somewhat of a buff, but it's going to be pretty noticeably worse.
Yeah, it's not great. Like it's fine. Like if you don't want to use Farina with her, you don't have Farina, or Farina's being used in another team. It's something that can work. It's not like unplayable, but it definitely does feel quite a bit worse. On top of that, there was like 3 people that own Shenhe, so like
Mix and match stuff differently, like Bennett, Xiangling Ororon, but it'll be worse.
that team specifically in this Abyss is actually pretty good because against Tulpa, which tends to be the hardest of the 3 chambers in this Abyss, Farina's a lot worse because Farina's damage won't do anything, and having a Hydro Bullet on Chasca will also not do anything. So the Bennett, Xiangling Ororon team is actually pretty good in this Abyss.
In conclusion, to give you a bit of a summary, I don't think she's going to be weak, but she is definitely going to have some gameplay issues. She's the sort of character that doesn't have great teams with defensive utility and has pretty big problems in AoE, which means while her performance against bosses and like speedrun performance and stuff like that is probably going to be pretty good, she is a sort of character that's probably not going to feel too great to play outside of the situations where she's good. It's something I mentioned about Kinich, and it's definitely something I felt ever since he came out, that he generally tends to feel worse than he should if you only look at his damage. I expect Chasca to have some similar issues. If you're willing to work around that, then she should be a fairly strong carry, but if that's something that you think will bother you, then it might be a reason not to go for her.
I don't think my thoughts have changed too much on her. I think this was one of my most accurate pre-releases. I really don't have much to add, so that's gonna pretty much do it for the post-release. I hope you all enjoyed. I hope you learned a thing or two, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.